The Extremis Publishing podcast is endorsed by Heart 200, Scotland's most exciting road trip. Find out more at heart200.scot.
My name's Eddie Small. We're in the University of Dundee where I lecture, and I'm in the company of Extremis Publishing, of Tom Christie. And it's my job today to ask Tom some questions about his favourite 5 films.
Hi Eddie, thanks very much for inviting me along.
You're very welcome. Tom, I asked you to send me a list of the 5 films in advance, and I must say I was quite surprised. How easy or how difficult was it for you to choose 5 films?
Very difficult, very difficult. Excruciatingly difficult actually, because I've seen one or two, it kind of goes with the job. Mm-hmm. So trying to narrow it down was a bit of a nightmare. And I think anyone who's familiar with my books won't be all that surprised with a predominance of 1980s films. But I think perhaps there might be 1 or 2 titles on there that might surprise people as well.
There are 1 or 2 I know very well. I'm not a film buff, but there are 1 or 2 I almost haven't heard of at all. So I'm really interested. It's quite an eclectic mix.
Yes, it is. And I think a lot of that possibly reflects on the 1980s themselves, because it was a decade that saw some really fantastic cinema and some incredibly original work.
Traditionally, we in these kind of things, we start with number 5 and work our way with number 1. I'd like to do it in reverse, if you don't mind. I'd like to start with the number 1, the film that is your choice, and Raiders of the Lost Ark. Yeah, tell me about it.
Well, I've always been a huge fan of Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's often considered one of the best films ever made, and certainly, one of the sort of archetypal action adventure films. And that really came at the centre of what was to become a golden age of action movies in the 1980s. It derived from George Lucas, who was the producer, that sort of harked back to his desire to make a sort of 1930s action serial movie for the modern day. And I think that possibly reflects back on the setting of the film, which was in the 1930s. It's an interesting film. One of the things that appealed to me most about it was the way that Steven Spielberg produces such an incredibly diverse cast of characters who are involved in so many really, interesting and evocative action sequences. But also what appealed to me was the fact that you have in Harrison Ford as Indiana Jones an academic character who's sort of moonlighting as this action hero, and I find that very interesting, the way that he's able to effortlessly switch from the tweed suit to the battered fedora in one easy move. Yeah.
It's fascinating. I mean, it is a film I do remember seeing it, and at the time I found it very exciting. A great pace to it.
It has absolutely, and it never misses a beat, which is one of the great beauties of that film. Actually, I mean, the editing is second to none, as is the John Williams soundtrack. I mean, everything about it, every element, just seems perfectly pitched. And other films in the series were very, very well made, but I don't think anything ever came close to matching just that sheer effortless sense of euphoria and that breakneck pace that the original film has.
Right. Where do you see it sitting in the pantheon of Spielberg films then? How well up his list of films would it be?
Oh, I think it's pretty well up, I would say. I mean, I'm a big fan of Spielberg's work right throughout his career. I've got a soft spot certainly for films like Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And I think even when Spielberg produces a misfire like 1941, you can still see the energy in it and the enthusiasm. But Raiders of the Lost Ark, I don't think it can be bettered actually. I mean, even given the sort of the dizzying heights of Spielberg's filmography, it strikes me as one of those films that was really quite a unique achievement.
What age would you have been when you first saw this film? And did that have any influence on your love of it?
I suppose it did, actually. I think I must have been about 7 when I saw it for the first time. I've seen it many times since. I think there's certainly an aspect of that, because you watch it when you're a kid and you enjoy it for the action sequences. You watch it as an adult and you see all the nuances and the various different references and callbacks that are made in that film. So yeah, I think there's certainly an aspect of that. It's a film you can enjoy at any age.
Yeah. When I saw your list and thought about that film, I did think of the excellence of the story itself, of the imagery across the whole thing, of the excitement that ran through it. So I wasn't all that hugely surprised. Might not have been my number one, but then when you showed me your number 2 film, I was surprised. Your number 2 film is Before Sunrise. Yes. And that's a Linklater film, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of my all-time favourite films, actually, because Richard Linklater, I think, really managed to catch lightning in a bottle with that film, both with the casting and with the dialogue, and also with a lot of the improvisation that takes place. When I first saw it, I was in my teens, and it reminded me a great deal of Louis Malle's film, My Dinner with Andre, in that you have 2 characters who spend most of the film conversing. The difference being, of course, in My Dinner with Andre, you're looking at 2 old friends who are meeting together for the first time in many years. And Before Sunrise, you're really looking at 2 complete strangers who find this extraordinary chemistry in one day together. And it strikes me as a kind of film, to be honest, that I think most people would love at some point in their lives an experience like that, to sort of meet someone, and whether it be a friend or a soulmate, just to be able to strike up that incredible sense of connection. And I think this film does it so brilliantly. Yeah,
the dialogue in the film, you're obviously impressed by.
Absolutely, and so much of it is improvised. You just have to read the original screenplay, which is Faber and Faber published, to see the deviation between the original screenplay and an awful lot of what's put into that film. And there is, of course, the bonus of having these wonderful Vienna scenes as well. You know, you really get a wonderful sense of Vienna as this living, breathing city, both by day and by night. So everything about it just works. There's a real magic to that film.
Do you think there's quite an equality between the 2 protagonists here, that they both get a fair share of the action in it?
Oh, absolutely, and that's I think part of the beauty of it, because they are 2 very, very different characters. One an idealist, the other one a cynic. They talk about all different topics and subjects, you know, be them ideological, be them philosophical, throughout the film. And there's a great deal of social commentary as well. I think possibly because the male protagonist, Jesse, is American, and his counterpart in the film, the female protagonist, is French, Céline, played by Julie Delpy. So there is a wonderful sense of commonality and culture clash in the films, and it's very carefully handled. It's never overdone.
You know, you wouldn't find 2 more different films. I would hazard to say between your first 2 choices. Is it a different part of your brain or a different you that likes these?
Quite possibly. I mean, I think they're quite an interesting complementary juxtaposition, actually, because when you look at Before Sunrise, it's a film that has a very leisurely pace. It doesn't rush anywhere. Raiders of the Lost Ark, you barely have time to catch breath. So yeah, I think they're definitely films to be enjoyed in different ways. Linklater has produced so many fascinating films in his career, but I don't think he's ever really beaten Before Sunrise. Even the 2 sequels, which are similarly very well made and beautifully observed, don't come close, I think, to that sense of magic he has in that film.
It was just a spot-on film, yeah. Let's move on to number 3 then. So number 3 is Ferris Bueller's Day Off by John Hughes.
Yes.
Yeah, so I thought we'd found 2 polar opposites. Now we've got almost 3 polar opposites, haven't we? Tell me about this film. What does it do for you and why?
Well, interestingly, I think I've written more about Ferris Bueller's Day Off than I've written about any other film, be it in studies about Hughes or in a separate study I wrote solely about that film. It's such an intriguing film because it amazes me the extent this film has to reach people. There's a universality to this film that really staggers me, because I've got friends in their 20s who watch this film, which was made before they were born, and still manage to connect with it in a way that I connect with it when I first saw it when I was about 7 or 8 years old. Now, it's an interesting film because much like Before Sunrise, who wouldn't want to have a day off like Ferris Bueller has? You know, when you get in your friend's Ferrari and you take off with your partner and your best pal, and you just have a day exploring a city. And John Hughes often said about the film that it was his love letter to Chicago. It was all of the places that he liked and admired about Chicago. He didn't just want to show you the locations, he wanted to show you the spirit of the city. He wanted to show you what the people were like, and what, you know, this incredible sense of style and energy that was there. But that could be true just about anywhere. I mean, you could easily have Ferris Bueller's Day Off in Dundee. Yeah. And I would like to see that film, to be honest, because it's just a film that speaks to people, and it's a film that everyone, I think, can relate to. Yeah,
and the characters in it, how well do they work on you?
Well, that's an intriguing thing, you see, because Ferris Bueller, you shouldn't, at some level, like Ferris Bueller, because it's basically rich kid does whatever he likes, and yet you can't help but like him, because he's just a interesting, engaging character. And you know, you have his friend who's going through a difficult patch in his life, who's asked himself fairly far-reaching questions about where he's going with his future. You have his girlfriend who similarly is looking at, you know, what does the future hold for the two of them, because he's heading off to college, she's still in high school. There is a depth of characterisation that's often overlooked in this film, but I think there is just such a breezy, enjoyable quality to it. I mean, John Hughes produced some fantastic character-observed comedies in the 1980s, including Planes, Trains and Automobiles, Uncle Buck, The Breakfast Club, all of which in their own way were excellent. But for me, I don't think he was ever to better Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Right. That's strong, because these are some pretty well-known and well-loved films, John Candy and et al. Yeah. We move then on to number 4, and yeah, this is different. Yeah. This is Ladri de Saponette, and it's Maurizio Nichetti. Why?
Well, do you know, I've loved this film since the day I first saw it, which was a Channel 4 screening late at night in the 1990s. This film is quite unlike any other, to be honest, and it's very postmodern in its approach. And it overplays its hand many, many times, but you just don't care, because you're enjoying it so much, you just go with it. And that's the beauty of it. It is, on one hand, a parody of Italian neorealism, because it's a satire of the bicycle thief, Ladri de Bicyclette. Ladri de Saponette, I'm told, is actually the soap thieves. And this is based on a line of dialogue from one of the characters, one of the children in the film. But Ladri de Saponette, because it's translated for international audiences as the icicle thief, as a parody of the bicycle thief, is interesting because it says a great deal about the film's general approach. Because in a sense, on one hand, you have this character who is a director, a kind of parodic construction of a rather pompous film director, who's trying very hard to emphasise the merits of his film, when in actual fact the audience realise he's actually been brought in as a last-minute substitution for a much more famous director, whose work is supposedly or should have been discussed. Yeah. On the other hand, Nichetti also plays the starring role in the film that is being produced by this director, and that in itself has this wonderful tongue-in-cheek charm to it, because he's incensed at the notion that these commercials are bleeding into the action of his film, not just because they disrupt the narrative, but because, you know, he comes out with lines to these various characters like, this is terrible, you're supposed to be impoverished and miserable, and why are you not? Things like that. So on the other hand, the film operates as a kind of satire on the encroachment of commercialism onto art for art's sake. And in that sense, it works beautifully. It's not necessarily the most subtle film to have made that point, but it does it with such panache it's difficult not to like it.
Yeah. So, yeah, McKetty actually plays two roles, I think, in it, doesn't he?
Yes, he does.
There are many directors that have put themselves in cameo roles.
Mm.
I'm thinking of Hitchcock, for example.
Yeah.
Does it work with McKetty, do you think? Good enough, I think?
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, you mentioned Hitchcock. I mean, he was so synonymous with his cameos. When you see Mel Brooks' film High Anxiety, there's even a Hitchcock lookalike in that film to kind of make it look as though Hitchcock himself had a cameo appearance. The beauty of McKetty appearing in this film, of course, is he operates both as director and as character. And in a way, it kind of emulates what Alistair Gray does in Lanark, A Life in 4 Books, where the author becomes embroiled in the action of the narrative and he comments on it. Nicetti as director is full of commentary about this film and actually can be quite critical about the characters and their actions. Of course, there is a beauty to that as well, because in a sense, you have the director being critical of characters he's written and characters who he's directing. So, there's a beautiful absurdity to that.
Yeah.
There is a theatre to the absurd in this film, which I think is beautifully played, never knowingly underplayed, but beautifully portrayed.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's part of this in black and white, this film?
Yes, it is.
Colour.
Yeah.
And how generally does that work in your mind, Tom?
It's interesting actually to see that, because the main film, because it's a parody of the Bicycle Thief, which was a post-war film, is in black and white. The use of colour is useful for two reasons. Firstly, because it demarcates this sort of magazine programme, this critical programme whereby Nicchetti's being interviewed in a kind of inside the actor's studio kind of way about the film. But it is also especially useful in the sense that he brings these characters in who are appearing in colour because they've come from this world of larger-than-life advertising. And there's this amazing visual clash between these big-budget adverts and then this film, which is obviously meant to be quite dingy and dark and austere. So, yeah, it works really well on both levels, and he has such obvious fun doing it.
How well was it received? I mean, presumably it's a different kind of audience from the Raiders of the Lost Ark that would be going to see this film.
Yes, absolutely.
How well was it received?
It was received well in Europe. It won awards in Europe. Less well elsewhere. It had rather a muted response in America when it first came out. Not necessarily hostile, but rather mixed. It has, however, since appeared on coursework in America, in film and media, as being quite an interesting example of how the global village was being portrayed internationally. I suppose there is an interesting comment to be made about globalisation and about commercialisation in the way that the film handles the topic.
Does it give you a sense of how different cultures view some films very differently and others are almost universally accepted? I think
it does. I mean, because The Bicycle Thief had such universal acclaim, and still does within Italian cinema, there is this definite sense that Nicchetti's going out there to make a statement, and he's kind of slaughtering the golden goose in a sense to make his point. So from that point of view, yes, I mean, I think there is very much this aspect of how Italian cinema viewed itself and how Nicetti viewed Italian cinema, and this kind of head-on collision with this much more commercial and aggressively profit-driven mode of filmmaking, which is what he seems to be protesting in the film.
It's amazing. And then we go to Back to the Future, with Back to the Future. That's your fifth choice. It's probably the one I know best because it's had so many sequels after it. Tell me what that did for you when you first viewed it.
Well, the 1980s had no shortage of fantastic sci-fi. And to be honest, I agonised for a long while about did I choose Back to the Future or Blade Runner, two films which could not be more different were it not for the fact that they're in the same genre. Why did I choose Back to the Future? Solely because I think it is possibly the perfect time travel film. I mean, some people point to the George Powell adaptation of The Time Machine in 1960 with Rod Taylor, but I think for modern audiences, in the way that it puts the characters across, the situations across, and in the way that it celebrates modern Americana, I don't think it can be beaten.
it's this wonderful DeLorean car that comes into that almost became a cult kind of thing. And DeLorean did sell a lot of cars.
Oh, he did.
Did that have an effect on it? But do these kind of added features work?
Well, it's interesting because I think the DeLorean had gone out of production by 85, and they really, I mean, I think Dr. Brown in the film explains that, you know, he wants to have a time machine that's a little bit of style to it. In the original draft of the film, they had used a refrigerator, and they were concerned that kids might harm themselves by going into the fridge. So they decided they needed to have a different kind of mode of time travel, and this is where the DeLorean had come from. It says a lot about the DeLorean, actually, because you wonder if it would necessarily have been so iconic if it hadn't been for this film. And yet they're making them now. I mean, I think you can £100,000 to buy a new one, 400 horsepower DeLorean. So they are still out there, and I'm sure that's part of the film's success, just because it was so different.
I mentioned the sequels. Do any of them rate, in your mind, anywhere near the original?
They're very useful as adjuncts to the original, I think. I mean, the version of 2015 that they have in Back to the Future 2 is as interesting to see what they got right as much as what they got wrong. And that's really useful because, in a sense, it's this very 1980s projection of what they believed 2015 would look like. And that's, I suppose, just as iconic as how 1955 was made to look in the film, where everything's gleaming and new and well tended. How they deal with the Western setting in the third film is also interesting, because there is this sense of almost a presentation of the Westerns of cinema past as much as of the American pioneer spirit. It is a film, I think, which really celebrates what America stands for. And one of those aspects was that pioneer spirit. So from that point of view, it is interesting to see just the direction that Robert Zemeckis takes it in, to say that basically Hill Valley was never entirely perfect, but the characters were always larger than life, and generally there was a community spirit.
Right. Where does Zemeckis sit in your idea of the directors of the world?
I have enormous respect for Robert Zemeckis because he's someone who's always pushing boundaries. I mean, he does make some interesting conventional films, What Lies Beneath being one of them. But you look at films like the 2009 adaptation of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, which was done using CGI and rotoscoping and various different film techniques. Now that film is just as remarkable for Jim Carrey's performance, the fact that he plays so many different characters, but it is particularly if you see it in 3D when it was as it was first produced and first screened, it's a very interesting film because you just get the feeling from start to finish, just as he did with the Polar Express, he's determined to do something new, and he's determined to bring something to audiences that they hadn't seen before. And I find there's something about that is enormously laudable. Even when he makes films like Welcome to Marwen, which hasn't been as well received critically, there's still this sense of a desire to produce something that's just that little bit different. Yeah.
And it works in this case, for sure.
Absolutely.
We seem to be stuck in these 1980s. Is that because you were at an age in the 1980s, or do you genuinely think that was the high point of filmmaking?
Well, I grew up at an opportune time because I was born in '79, and VHS and Betamax, home entertainment systems, were coming into public use in the 80s as I was, getting of an age to watch films. So, in a sense, I was really very fortunate to have grown up at a time when I had access through video rental shops to lots and lots of different films. And I think the 80s have a very special place in a lot of people's hearts, largely because of the sheer variety of films that were produced, but also because there was an incredible sense of originality to those films. I think it marks an interesting kind of transition between the 70s and the sort of auteur-led films that you saw then, films like The French Connection and The Godfather and films like that, and the 90s where things were becoming much more extensively profit-driven. And you look now where everything is a remake or a reimagining or a prequel or a sequel. The 80s were just ahead of that movement. These films are so iconic that so many of them have been made and remade, and over the years. It says a great deal for the importance of them, and also for the way that they still seem to speak to people.
Nowadays, graphics are just quite incredible, certainly more enhanced than they would have been in these days. Do you feeling that almost hasn't helped filmmaking?
Well, I mean, there's certainly a lot of practical effects in 1980s films, and it's interesting there's a kind of renaissance in those practical effects, because you see films like, for instance, The Dark Crystal and Labyrinth, the Jim Henson Workshop films in the 80s, they are now being made anew for audiences in the present day, and they're going back to these sort of practical film techniques, or you're seeing a mixture of the practical and the CGI. I mean, in the 90s, CGI was a big thing, and it intrigues me because I think that's reached a stage now, particularly when you see actors de-aged or recreated, as was the case with Peter Cushing in Rogue One recently. You start to see, I think, a movement now almost back towards more traditional filmmaking techniques, and I find that quite interesting, because the 80s had an interesting mix of traditional storytelling and also this desire to be bigger and better and go for these blockbuster effects. So yeah, I mean, from that point of view, that intrigues me.
Let's go back to where I started. Choosing 5 out of the number of films that even I've seen, but that you've seen, is quite incredible. Was it your mood that dictated what the 5 were going to be? Were you in a bad mood that day, or a good mood? Or?
Well, I think there's probably something to suit every taste on that list. There's comedies, there's dramas, there's larger-than-life action, there's films that make us look at ourselves and make us kind of wonder if what we want from life. So yeah, I mean, I think it is interesting, because cinema, from my point of view, has always been about the human experience and films that speak to us as people. And I think all of these films speak to me in a slightly different way. You would possibly be in a different mood to enjoy Raiders of the Lost Ark, for instance, than you would be to enjoy Larry de Saponet. They don't strike me as being a logical double bill, but I think they all have interesting things in different ways to say about how we live our lives and what we take from cinema as entertainment versus what we take from cinema as artistic discipline.
So how do you judge a film? Do you look at box office success, or does it just what tickles Tom's fancy?
Well, I think it's, for me personally, it's what works as a film, because it's amazing how often a film will do badly on a commercial level, but will develop an incredible commercial following down the line, because the critics and the audiences don't always agree. I mean, I mentioned Blade Runner earlier, a film that had a very troubled production and didn't do well at the cinema, but has been since reissued many times in different formats, director's cuts and ultimate cuts and things like that, and has since gone on to spawn a sequel. You don't get much more of a cult 1980s film than Blade Runner. And yet it's true of so many other films. I mean, even things like the Rocky Horror Picture Show, which is almost critic-proof now because it's so such a cult success. So no, box office isn't all that big of a deal as far as I'm concerned. I find it interesting if other people have shared the same view, but the great beauty of film criticism and film commentary generally, I think, is to find out what other people like. And if people take something totally different away from a film, if they love it, if they hate it. There are as many different responses to a film as there are films, I think. Yeah.
Let me just finish by asking you, are there any genres that you just don't bother watching at all? I'm thinking musicals or some of the Ealing stuff or whatever.
Yeah. No, I love the Ealing films. Musicals less so, I have to say. I think everybody has their own tastes. I've never been a huge musical fan. Comedies, yes. Sci-fi, definitely. But what interests me most are films that cross genre boundaries. And you see that with films like Before Sunrise, where there's an element of drama, an element of comedy, but the whole thing is really a character-based experience, really. And how you perceive it will vary because everybody has a slightly different take. So yeah, I would say any film that pushes the envelope, tries to do something slightly different, perhaps as what Billy Connolly calls a sideways look on life. That's the kind of film I go for. And I think all of these films that we've talked about today have been a bit like that. They've all been slightly different from the norm.
Absolutely. Tom, that's been brilliant. If they ever ask me my top 5 podcasts, I'm sure this will be somewhere in the top 5. This has been very enlightening. Your level of knowledge and erudition on this subject is really impressive. So thanks for taking the time out to speak to me.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Harry. It's been good to be here.
If you would like to find out more about advertising on the Extremis Publishing podcast, please visit their website at www.extremispublishing.com for details.